So most people who are starting off from scratch in code and they want to kind of go into a career or they just want to become really good at code, I think inevitably end up looking at Leetcode or some kind of similar site. Now, recently on the channel, I put up a question asking how many of you guys use something like Leetcode. Around 35% said yes, so you either use Leetcode or something similar, which is pretty interesting. So before my current job as a software engineer, I worked as a lecturer for a good couple of years. I worked kind of doing one-to-one tutoring. And again, Leetcode came up as one of those things as, should I do Leetcode? And you kind of get this camp of some people are like, yeah, you absolutely have to do Leetcode to get these really cool jobs in tech. And it kind of got me thinking about how important Leetcode actually is. So I've kind of done a bit of a reflection back on some of the questions and some of the things that Leetcode teaches. So what I'm going to try and do in this video is kind of boil down the things I think Leetcode does really well and the things I think Leetcode doesn't really teach. Then I want to give my overall feeling on if you're using Leetcode to kind of further your programming career or just your kind of Python skills, how should you do it and what should you supplement it with? So the three things I think that Leetcode is really good at teaching you is optimization, problem solving, and looking at common design patterns. So I'm going to quickly flick over to the screen and I want to show you exactly what I mean with a really simple example. This is the two-sum question, and I think it's probably one of the most popular questions in Leetcode, if I'm honest. And this is one of those things where I've given this to my students many times, and it's really good at teaching optimization and specifically how to use dictionaries to your advantage. Now, in case you've not seen this question before, you're effectively given a list such as this here, and the idea is that you have to find the indices within this list which add up to target. So in this case here, 2 and 7 equal 9, so you have to return the indices of 0 and 1. Now, the most kind of simple way of doing this is to kind of do this kind of really gnarly nested for loop over this list, and it becomes pretty horrible, pretty slow, and you can see because of how long the list actually gets, it becomes just dramatically slow and pretty horrible. But there is a really nice solution to this using a dictionary, and you can make it all happen in linear time and everyone's happy. For situations like that, I think for teaching optimization, Leetcode is really good. And in fact, many of the problems you do, you will try and do it in this kind of brute force manner, and it simply doesn't run fast enough. So you're kind of forced to really think out the box, really think about how you're iterating over stuff. And over time, it's difficult at first. I get it. I found it hard at first as well. It kind of teaches you to do things in as close to as linear time as humanly possible. And if you're trying to take your Python skills to the next level and perhaps get a job in the industry, that's something that I think is really important. If you can write code which is really optimal and doesn't always go for the brute force solution, then I think that's really good, and Leetcode does a really good job of that. The second reason is problem solving. Now, of course, Leetcode is all about solving problems, of course. And one of the things it does quite well is it gives you kind of abstract scenarios or kind of real life scenarios to try and solve. So quite often you're forced to kind of read this big story, which can often, it can take 5-10 minutes to try and figure out what it's even asking you. And it forces you to kind of take this thing and try and convert it into something that is in Python, which is quite nice. For a lot of beginners, that can be quite difficult at first. But I think it's one of those things where in the industry, you're often having to break down complex problems and try and solve complex things. So having that skill to take a complex question, break it down into meaningful code, I think that plays through quite nicely to making you a better programmer. And again, that's why I think doing Leetcode is really good. It just makes you a generally better problem solver. And the third reason why I think Leetcode is good is looking at common design patterns. Believe it or not, a lot of the problems in Leetcode are sometimes identical, or if not, they're at least really close to each other. So the more problems you do and the more you solve, especially like the medium to hard kind of level, the better you get at recognizing a problem and then recognizing how to solve that problem. And again, I think it's difficult because it's one of those things that comes purely just with time doing Leetcode and time solving problems. But I think this is something that you can apply to your coding life outside of Leetcode. So the more problems you solve, the better you get at recognizing a problem and then how to solve that particular problem. So of course, if you see the same problem later on in life, but just kind of reformatted into a different way, it's something you've already done before, and hopefully you can apply the solution to when you solved it last time to how you're now solving it this time. I appreciate that's probably quite wordy, but I think the bottom line for that one is it teaches you lots and lots of different design patterns in code. And the more you can reinforce those different patterns, the better. Now, in terms of what Leetcode doesn't do that well or doesn't enforce that well, I think there are a couple of things, so I'll talk about them really briefly here, and then I'll list them all up on the screen at the end so you can see them. The first thing I think it doesn't teach you that well is code quality. So you could submit code that has the worst variable names, it's not PEP 8 compliant, and Leetcode doesn't care. It'll just accept it. As long as it passes the unit tests, it's like, yeah, cool, go for it. Of course, if you're working as part of a big software team, you need to have really well formatted code that others can read. So my advice for this would be, if you're doing Leetcode, also try and run your code through a linter. So if you can use something like Rough or Black or PyLint or something like that, run the code through that and just make sure that it also complies with what those linters want as well. That way you're writing good code for Leetcode, and it's also formatted in a really nice professional way. The second thing I think it doesn't do awfully well is a lot of the kind of more boring utilitarian stuff we tend to do. So we have to do things like logging quite a lot. You have to know how to use custom loggers, so logging to console, logging to files, sending logs off via email, etc. To my knowledge, I've not seen a huge amount of that on Leetcode. So again, if you're completely new to logging, I'd recommend taking like a small logging course and just knowing kind of what logging is all about, what it does, the benefits of it, because if you're going to go work in the industry, logging is an absolute must. So I'd highly recommend looking at that as well. The next one, I guess, is a bit more technical, and it's on file handling and exception handling. So if, suppose you're working in an office, you're writing the back end for some really kind of funky app. Your app is receiving files, it's processing those files, it's spitting them out into a nice front end. Your code's going to have an awful lot of exception handling and kind of safeguards in place to make sure it actually performs well and doesn't give the front end any issues. And again, Leetcode doesn't really teach you that. So, for example, what I would try and do here is look at all of the built-in exception types and look at what those exceptions do when they're raised, and I'd practice doing things like try, except, and finally statements as well. If your code can run really safely, it can handle all of the edge cases, then perfect, that's really good. And in fact, Leetcode quite often does throw really funky edge cases into some of its questions, but I would recommend looking at all of the built-in exceptions, figuring out what they do, especially a lot of like the file related ones, so things that relate to files, permissions, OS errors, etc., stuff like that. And the last one is a lot of the third-party libraries. So the Leetcode questions tend to focus more about the standard library. Of course, you can use things like functools, itertools, collections, stuff like that. But things like requests, things like the OS directory, things like pathlib, things that you're going to be using all the time if you're working in the field. Again, Leetcode doesn't really give you much for that. So again, just to reiterate those, I would look at requests. I'd look at things like pathlib, so how to handle file systems, platform agnostic. If you use OS, it's not particularly great. I'd definitely recommend using pathlib instead. It's much better for that kind of stuff. So just to round it off, we've looked at 3 different ways upon which Leetcode can be really useful, and we've looked at a couple of different ways upon which Leetcode might be missing the mark in terms of teaching you to become an overall better Python developer. And I get this asked quite a lot is, how should I kind of be moving forward? Should I be doing entirely Leetcode or should I be doing a mix? And really the answer, again, it's not a particularly great one, is it depends on you. If you're going to a job which does Leetcode for its interview questions or those kind of things, I would quite happily be on the Leetcode grind and try and do as best as I can at those sort of questions. But otherwise, I'd recommend doing kind of a handy mix. Whether it's 10% Leetcode, 90% everything else, depends entirely on you, to be honest. But I'd recommend doing a healthy mix of maybe 20, 30% Leetcode or similar kind of questions and doing a variety of those questions. And the rest of it is just kind of doing general Python stuff. So whether you're looking at courses, books, make sure you're building your own projects. I would keep it as diverse as I possibly can. I think if you just stick to one particular area and just go all the way doing that, you kind of got blinkers on doing one thing. The more domains of Python you can do, then arguably the better. So suppose, for example, you did maybe 20% Leetcode, you did like 40% on a course, and then maybe the remaining 40%, you're building your own projects that kind of cover a number of different areas and all use Git. Then I think that's a nice, well-rounded approach. I'd be really keen to hear in the comments, how often do you do Leetcode? Do you find it really helpful? And are there certain things that you think Leetcode teaches you that you wouldn't have done otherwise? Again, I'd be really keen to hear what your experiences are, guys. Cheers for watching, and I'll see you all in the next session.